So, I'm tasked tonight with talking about why I am a poet, which is a very difficult question to answer. And in fact, I think it's almost impossible because the answer seems so intrinsic as to why I'm a human being. And in reality, I think the reason why I'm a poet ties into the reason why all of us are here. Ask yourself, why are you a creative person? I heard music being played earlier. I heard discussions. All of us people here are creative, right? And we all enjoy that rush that comes from creativity. And so we're all here for the same reason. And in reality, this is not so much about myself, but it's answering a question about all of us. Why are we all here? Why do you enjoy reading, writing, painting, playing music? So it's easier to describe an individual's creative process, but it's not easy to answer the question of what causes that process and what meaning is found in that process. I think the easiest way I can explain as to why I'm a poet is because I'm a reflection of God. So the first story from the Judeo-Christian Bible is this story about God coming to this cold, dark ball, and it has nothing on it except water and darkness, and then God makes something of it, and he stands back and he calls it good. And whenever we create something, whether it's poetry or sculpting something or playing music, that same God bends down with us next to our ear, and as we stand back and say, this is good, this creation is good, God does the same. See, we're created in the very image of God. And I think that's the easiest way I can explain as to why I'm a poet. Are we so surprised that being created in the image of God, we don't reflect those same talents and skills? That's why I'm here. That's why I'm a poet. I have 5 examples of poems that describe several things about the poetry I write. They show my creative process over the course of the past 5 years. All of these poems are chronological. They show different perspectives and worldviews that I had and that I hold now. They talk about my joys and sorrows and sins and tragedies. But all of them speak to this idea of creation and the Spirit of God. I always wrote poetry as a child, but I didn't really begin writing poetry in earnest until I met the troupe of monkeys, that is, the Perspectives, which is Lynn and Obi and Tosh and Grace, and James came on later, and there's a few other people who kind of faded in and out. That's when I began writing poetry in earnest. But a lot of the early poetry that I wrote, even in childhood and going into the Perspectives, was very sentimental, way too overwritten. A lot of metaphors that were difficult to follow. The first poem I'm going to share with you guys tonight is the first poem that I think is genuine to myself. The poem is titled Sarcasm, and it talks about my own sins. And it's looking forward to a day when I'm going to be a more balanced individual, a more mature individual. I was really hard on myself as a teenager. I had this perfect person I thought I should be, and in general, I acted like that perfect person around other people. The problem is I hid who I was inside. I didn't show other people the kind of person I really was. I think all of us struggle with this very basic hypocrisy. You know, it's not bad to want to be this perfect person and to pursue that, but don't stop showing people the person you actually are. Don't be afraid to admit that you make mistakes. That's the difference between a person who's genuine and a person who's hypocritical. So this first poem starts chipping away at that facade of that perfect person I thought I was. I think we all live with this fear that others are going to turn away if we show them our weaknesses, but the reality is, if we show them our weaknesses, if we admit our mistakes, if we are a genuine person, we draw our friends closer to us. And it's a way of actually healing and finding forgiveness for our sins. Sarcasm. Your brokenness vespers some bloody good ditty of hatred, unseemly, revolting. This sorrow of sorrows is tailored and tacked to sanctus sanctorum. Your grief is a sow, drawn and then quartered. Incense the cherubs, flick pig's blood on them. The leper performs his vows. But this is your illusion. Could hell ever relish a dribble of water? Cursed is your tongue, your mindless unceasing, your vespers, your hatred and sorrow, your bloody goodness. Your sea urchin conscience is caged in a box, a lead-lined spikenardian box. But I caught in a raindrop the grief of a wave, the tide and tattoo of a sorrowful sea. And in such a drop the grief becomes joy, spumed and spindrifted, swollen and frothy. This white-crested thrill, this hatred and freedom. Fear thou the deep, though the waves are of hatred, but if you should sink, your lungs will breathe water. Weep tears of joy, depth of the oceans, Weep for forgiveness. Weep to be free. So that poem is hard to follow. And again, I sent it to the Perspectives. They liked it a lot. And it's hard to follow, and it's very meaningful to me. But the reason I chose to put it in as a first poem is because it kind of chipped away at that hypocritical person I was. And that's the good thing about writing poetry that is introspective. Because when you write poetry that criticizes yourself, it's looking at you from a third eye, if even from the eye of God, and it's saying, here's where your faults are. You can fix this. You can move on. The next poem is a series of 3 poems that I combined into one, and it's detailing a trip that I took in Europe when I was 19 with my brother and my sister-in-law, and we flew into some place in Europe. I forget the city. I should remember this. But we flew into some place, took a long trip through the Alps up to Salzburg, and then from Salzburg we went to Warsaw, and in Warsaw we met up with a troupe of singers called the Hope Singers, led by Lloyd Kaufman. And so these poems are called impressionistic poems, and they were written very rapidly, very much the same methodology that, say, an impressionistic painter would use to paint. Very quick dabs of light, nothing very clear. Things are more obscure, but when you stand back, you kind of get the overall picture, the mood of the time and the day. Blur, Salzburg, 8:13 p.m. My shirt stuck to my chest like wet garbage, but there, streaming through the hullabaloo of brakes and cigarette smoke, I saw her, pregnant and pedaling a bicycle, with no hands, as if she skimmed above the cobble. Moving with the heartbeat of the city, she was a blur to time in my humble eyes, and in that moment I thought she was almost omniscient. Almost. The train, Salzburg, 4:52 a.m. The empty city sleeps, reminiscent of old lives and loves that sleep now in perpetuity. I can sense her sorrow in the rain and the smell of the taxi man's sweat. Perhaps if parting ways must be had, beckoned by nothing else except these transient moments, then I too must depart, saluting all and no one. And thus I sleep, swaying to and fro on the 18 coach, nor is my conscience harried by thoughts of new affairs with brighter lights and blonder loves. No, this city may be sorrowful sometime, but who could know? Not I. For now she sleeps, as do I, gently swaying to and fro on the 18 coach. Warsaw, 9:18 p.m. I could find no substance to my thoughts. I searched and found nothing but sweat and the scars here and about of old temptations. But then from the yellow quarters and the cracks in the tiled corners, through the paneled walnut door of my meditations, I heard the intimations of a song, an ebb and flow like sirens chanting cherubs' hymns, yet distant in their descants. Such lovely echoes to the smell of must, such comfort in contrast to a strange bed and an unfamiliar sunset. Beauty is more aptly worshipped in its subtleties. The anticipation of beauty is more compelling than beauty itself. And the memory of some hallowed chords sung in the lonely recesses of my mind is far fairer still than to have tasted such and have them end. No, give me hope. Give me the memories of beauty. I am content with them, and I will find healing in them. 2 things I want to point out and highlight from those last 2 poems. The first is, the really amazing thing about poetry is that it's a distillation of languages and its sounds, right? But not just language and sound, it's a distillation of what that language thinks, of that culture, of its experiences. And we read a passage from Proverbs, or even if you're thinking about ancient poetry and just ancient things written, especially poetry, think of like the Proverbs that we just read, or Psalms 23. They're valuable not just because they're in the Bible, but they're valuable because you can look back at someone like, say, King David and say, this is how that guy believed about God. This is his theology. And it's incredibly valuable for that because it informs our theology. If King David had never existed, we would not understand. I don't think we would have a fully formed theology like we do today. That's the powerful thing about poetry. And so when you write poetry, it might end up in an attic 300 years from now, or it might end up in an anthology. But in the least, you're contributing to academia, to society, to history, because someday when someone reads your stuff, They're going to say, this is this person's worldview. This is his opinions. This is her theology. This is how she viewed her friends. And that's why writing poetry is so important, other than that it's a creative process and other than the fact that sometimes we just need to write poetry for ourselves. But you're writing poetry because you contribute to this flowing mass of humanity that continues on and on. The second point I would like to highlight is about this idea of anticipation, and it goes back to the line I just read in the poem that says, "The anticipation of beauty is more compelling than beauty itself." So, I tend to believe that the anticipation of something, of anything, is always greater than the thing itself. Without anticipation, without the urge to do something or accomplish something, how would we ever get it done? Perhaps anticipation is in and of itself the very root of our consciousness. The fact that we drive ourselves forward every day towards what? All of us are constrained to this thing called linear time, and our lives are constructed around this line, away from birth into childhood, away from innocence towards a greater self-awareness, away from utter foolishness toward this open-eyed panic that there's nothing that can be done to seize time, and that nothing, absolutely nothing, is capable of peering past death. None of us have eyes so keen or perception so powerful that we understand with absolute certainty what happens to us when we die. We take religion's word for it, the things that other people have said, that God said what's going to happen to us when we die. And we believe it. And I would say we should believe it shamelessly. Every person must believe something about death, whether it means the afterlife or a total end, because to do otherwise is the very antithesis of anticipation. To not anticipate something is to say that life is not worth living. And the only reason life is worth living is because of the anticipation of some end that is going to be good. To the Christian, or perhaps to every religious person, the concept of the afterlife must be good in order for it to be lived for. And what of the atheist or the cynic? Well, here's the deal. If you can find comfort in heaven, even though you have no evidence for that, if you find this comfort in heaven, it's more than likely because you were born into it as a Christian culture and you have faith in that. And that's okay. But at the same time, others can find comfort in the inevitability of death and in the reality that when the body dies, the body ends and is subsumed into the circle of life. The human anticipates death as much as they do living. Or perhaps to state it differently, the human's understanding of an end is the greatest motivator to live now while living is possible. And perhaps someday, if we're capable of retrospection beyond death, then we'll understand the anticipation of the afterlife was the only thing that made life itself so real and tangible and joyful and good. And in that sense, the anticipation of the thing, of the afterlife, is greater than the thing itself. When I was a child, I thought as a child, I understood as a child, but when our bodies become dust and when our consciousness moves on, subsumed by God, when mortality leaves us, then we'll understand that to put off the childish delight of living, the very fact of death to all of us was only possible by being a mortal child first. By finding joy in living. And so I would say, live as a child. Find delight in knowing that you delight. Find delight in knowing that your delight is this anticipation of the end, and that your anticipation is greater than the thing itself. I'm a poet because I'm alive. And being alive is the best thing that must necessarily be because I know nothing else. And it's the very knowledge of this anticipation of something else that causes me to write poetry and live and laugh and love. And speaking of love and anticipation, is a poet really worth their salt if they never write poems about love? So love is this weird thing, and here's how I kind of like, here's how I think love works, right? So you go up to someone and you really like their face or like the way they, play piano, and you're like, hey, I like you, you should love me. And sometimes they say, yeah, you wear nice clothes. And then you meet up and you marry and you move on and die. Other times they're like, no, I don't love you, and you have to move on, and that's love. And again, it's very oversimplified. But poets love writing about love, and there's a reason for that. Love is just such an odd thing. Stranger than love itself is the reason why we love, which again is a very difficult question to answer. Or maybe the question of love is actually really simple. We love because loving is inherent to being human. We don't need to know why something is inherent. Because while all of us could question why love is, or why it is inherent, it doesn't change the fact that we all love. So, why does this have to do with why I'm a poet? Because I'm a human and I'm capable of love. And the fact that I write about love shows my humanity. I want to explain the next poem before I read it because it's about love. It's titled Jesse's Poem, and the gist of the poem is that Jesse's having a conversation with me about a girl he loves. And he's very conflicted about this girl, and because it's not working out for him. And this poem is an absurd poem, and I wrote them at a certain period of my life where I wrote a lot of absurd poetry. They're really obscure and they're hard to understand, but they tell stories, and they're weird. And so Jesse's poem is about love, and it's about rejection, right? Jesse's poem. I turned in my sheets while dreaming, Jesse said, forgetting everything, and I forgot who she was and even her name, because I was the man with the rudder, screaming to the other men with the oars, don't stop now, don't let the rain give her trivial and stupid excuses. This is pursuit as much as survival. I screamed, Jesse said. Tiny pebbles of water were spat into my face, but then from the corners of my eyes, I saw an apparition crawling on the water. A white thing, whiter than the lightning that split the curtains of midnight. And suddenly, the heaving water seemed a place of shelter greater than these grinding boards beneath my feet. And so I hurled myself towards the storm without knowing why. And I wondered then, suspended between the boat, the storm, and the swirling, writhing waters, how deep her insecurity must be if she must prove that she's still my friend. Why must you prove anything? Is it already evident? Is this an apology? Or is there something deeper you wanted to express, but you're afraid to express because if you did, you would fall in love? And then I woke up, Jesse said. But I was singing, and I only remember singing. Behute mich Gott, Jesse says. Ich vertraue dir. Du zeigst mir den Weg zum Leben. Bei dir ist Freude. Freude in Fülle. Keep me, O God, Jesse says. For I trust in you. You show me the path of life. By you is gladness and fullness of joy. The last stanza jabs at this idea that Jesse had placed all of his spiritual chips on the table when it came to this relationship. And then God, or rather the girl who has full autonomy and can choose to reject or not reject, said no. And as a result, his little world was crushed. His little ego was crushed. And if you ask me, Jesse was none the worse for wear. He can just move on and be content with friendship. Like, it's not a big deal. But this does beg the question, why are we taught, or why do we think that every little thing, such as love, is something that we need to spend hours and hours on our knees seeking, God's will for? There's this idea that if you spend X amount of time in prayer or meditation or study, pleading with God for something or about something, that if it works out, it must have been God's will. And if it doesn't work out, well, it must not have been God's plan. I don't really agree with that. Why put so much effort into seeking God's will when God has already given every single human being the mind and will, the judgment, to make fully capable, wise, and just decisions between what is good and what is evil? So either human beings are puppets controlled by God, or they have free will. And if this is so, if humans do have free will, then I would say lean into that free will and choose. If you choose what is good, if you balance your life after what is right, if you seek righteousness in your personal affairs and in the affairs of others, then you are automatically doing God's will. So I can automatically hear the question that some might have in response to this, which is, well, what do you do if you don't know what is right or wrong? Well, sometimes acting, like asking a girl out, takes a risk. And it's not whether or not it's a wrong decision, right or wrong decision, it's that you acted. And sometimes if you say ask a girl out and she says no, well, God has still given you the full capabilities of dealing with that blow to your ego, right? I mean, it's all God's will, right? But on a more serious note, The fact that you use your own God-given abilities to judge and weigh the world, whether it's asking a girl out or whatever it is, climbing into your car, the fact that you judge to do rightly, the fact that you act, is using your own autonomy, and in that way you are worshiping God. The point I'm working towards is this fact that humans have free will to choose who they love and to choose to heal if they're rejected, which again makes a more worshipful and thankful human being. This human is not afraid to act even if it seems like there is a risk, because the human judges using their God-given mind and will that acting now is good whatever the consequence. And again, that's reflected in the poem. It's like, dude, just go ask her, and if she turns you down, move on. But sometimes God lets us down, and this kind of changes to this idea, problem of evil. So if everything is like, if God exists, why did this girl say no to me, right? Painful things happen sometimes. So let me explain what I mean by God lets us down. God hears every single prayer, right? Whether you pray for a girl or a dog or a truck, but not every prayer is answered. We live in a world where everyone has complete autonomy of how they live, who they love, the God they worship, and why are we so surprised when we pray and pray and pray about something and it doesn't work out? It doesn't mean that God doesn't care. It just means that people can choose. And sometimes we can choose to do something God doesn't care about or does, which might end up being a decision that kind of wrecks someone else's plans. It's not God's fault. It just seems like God let us down. And then this begs the question, why do bad things happen, and what is this problem of evil? Painful things happen, and sometimes they're good, and sometimes they help us become better people. Pain must always be a means and never an end. I do believe that. But the very realization of pain is the first loss of innocence. And the loss of innocence is really important because it has to do with the next poem I'm talking about. What is this loss of innocence? What is this pain that we experience every day? I don't care what system of theology you have or live your life by, but none of them really adequately solve the problem of evil. Some of them are really bad at it, like Calvinism. Others, like Arianism, do a lot better by saying, oh, humans have choice and they can do evil. But still, no system of theology adequately says why evil exists. So let's ponder this question of evil. And again, it's related to the poem that will be read next. The realization of evil is the first loss of innocence. The most painful realization I have in my life is that innocence is always lost, but never completely. With a rising self-awareness from childhood comes this loss of innocence. We're never completely aware of how much we know. And definitely never aware of how random facts, small lifestyle changes, the progression of age and time truly affect us. And so no one really knows what pockets of innocence still live in our brain. But all of us are painfully aware of the innocence we once had that is now lost. What does it mean to know? What does it mean to be conscious? And what is knowledge? And why is it so powerful in drastically altering our view of life from childhood that says the world is entirely good? Painful and evil things occur, that's a fact. And the loss of innocence can be a powerful mechanism of self-defense in an evil world. And yet to describe it that way seems like us using an evil to fight a greater evil. And the fact that each of us understands this loss of innocence is why the story of Adam and Eve connects with every single human being. Because we need a story that makes sense of why we lose innocence. What does it mean to go from knowing something to not knowing something? And so the story of Adam and Eve and the fall helps make sense of that. The loss of innocence and the gaining of knowledge and experience is also linear along with time. We can't go back to a time when we were less innocent or where we were less knowledgeable of the world and its evils. The best we have is memory. But even memory fades. And that's a sorrowful thing. The realization of the loss of innocence, of pain, the fact that we know that memories fade is, I think, one thing that drives us forward to seek the goodness that remains. And now as an adult, I think that the anticipation of innocence to me seems to be greater than what it meant to be a child, without any concept of evil or even of the innocence that protected me from the knowledge of good and evil. The anticipation of a time and place beyond ourselves where innocence exists entirely and where we can experience innocence again drives us onward. I wonder sometimes if the anticipation of innocence again after we have lost our innocence, the anticipation that there is a place like that out there where innocence is again, where innocence is full and free, where we know nothing. I wonder sometimes if that anticipation is not what drives us forward to live our life to the fullest. And yet we'll never really know if this place exists. But I think that that primal spot of innocence still left in our head tells us that it does. And that's why we write poetry. That's why we write literature that glimpses towards that small patch of innocence that we can only see whenever we write poetry. So I'm a poet because I can weep through poetry, weep the loss of innocence. And I'm a poet because I don't know any other way to describe that loss of innocence. I'm a poet because I don't know how else to describe evil or good. And I'm a poet because when I write poetry, for one splendid golden moment, I glimpse a time and place where memories don't fade and where innocence never ends. This next poem is untitled. There is always a sigh when the warring is done, a downward glance, a shiver, an emptiness pleading to be filled, a silence keening across the fields like a killdeer lost in the midnight. There is always a silence that curls my tongue, and what are these tears that blur my eyes? What is all of this light between us? Even the most distant stars have no voice because no one can hear them. Even though they resound, yet no one has seen their shimmering. Where has the warmth of my childhood hidden? Where are the green leaves? Where is the dove that cooed on the line to the glorious morning? Where are the hills and the paths leading there? The dew on the grass, the summer, the unceasing summer. Love so fragrant and sweet flows from these memories unbidden. Where is the innocence I have never known? I have grappled with you until my hips are broken. I have danced with you until my fingers are torn. And here is the shudder, the dull roar, the downwardness falling, an emptiness, the anguish, the grief as endless as the sand of the sea, a hunger like that of a bird and its keening, lost in the midnight and weeping. So why am I a poet? To return again to the opening paragraphs, I'm a poet because the act of creation reflects the Spirit of God. But as a poet, I often use that craft to express both my doubt and faith in that God. The next poem is about how, as culturally Christian people, we both live with doubt and faith in God. I don't think any one of us here contains total and complete blind faith in God, because there's always a measure of reserve. And that's not a bad thing. It just means that if the majority of your life is molded around certain core principles or beliefs about God, that you chose to believe those, despite your reservation. The question that remains, though, is what existed in that void before you chose faith? That other times, what is the emptiness or the apathy that you feel towards a certain principle of faith that other times is vibrant and unswayed? And what is the hinge between both faith and doubt? And I believe it's choice. So as I mentioned before, there always exists a measure of reserve towards anything, especially towards God. If tomorrow I had irrefutable evidence to prove that God did not exist at all, it would change our beliefs to some extent. And again, that's not a bad thing. We have the capacity to react to the world, to choose and judge, to say, I don't believe this, I choose to believe this. But back to this issue of faith and doubt. Don't be afraid when you doubt. In fact, be more afraid if you find yourself believing something fully or doubting something fully. See, faith is not a blind thing. Faith forms a theory and then gathers evidence, forms a hypothesis, tests the hypothesis until faith becomes a fact-supported thing. Faith, or to reach a place of faith, is also a linear progression away from the innocence of doubt into the faith of choosing what you believe for whatever reason. Faith does not always bring comfort, and to have faith and believe something and pattern your life after this belief can be a very painful thing, especially if it's a hard truth that alters your life drastically. It's easier to doubt. It's easier to lack complete understanding, to remain uninformed or choiceless. But I'm digressing slightly. This next poem talks about faith and doubt. And again, in my opinion, balance yourself between the two. And this poem also ends my segment for this weekend. But it doesn't resolve this issue of faith and doubt. And it doesn't even worship. The poem engages with this idea of giving ourselves over to God, or at least giving ourselves over to some system of Christianity as a lifestyle. It addresses the fear that none of us really know who God is, but we have an opinion or an ideal based off what others in our cultures have told us. The question of this poem is, what lives on after I give myself to the ideal or reality of God? Is God such a monster that he would subsume all of my autonomy into himself, leaving me nothing more than a shell of a human who is alive on the inside but totally dead on the outside? Does God so despise my weak human flesh? Does he see it so thoroughly sinful that all he wants is to possess the mind and soul and leave the body with no personality, merely a puppet to the invisible morals of the spiritual realm? I wrote this poem over my first Christmas break, and during the following semester, I wrote a poem about Jonah. And the poem I'm about to read is an introduction to the poem of Jonah. Some of my friends here have heard the poem of Jonah, and I would love to read it sometime, not here. But the story of Jonah is really interesting because it has a lot to do with this poem, because I wonder if Jonah didn't ask that question. What happens after myself, after I give myself? After all of us give up ourselves, what is left? And so this poem is titled After Ourselves. After ourselves, after we come to the end of ourselves, it matters not then why or when. It matters not in the least if God had not spoken, if his words were held back in silence like a knife to our naked back. It matters not what God had not said. I was taught to fight the silence of God with prayers that pled to be answered. If God is silent, I was told, your heart must be full of doubt. And believing this, I made every prayer the same. 1,000,000 daguerreotypes rolled from my tongue, all the same. 10,000 vivid images reminding God that he must be good to me as if he needed reminding. I wore down my tongue telling God that his work was to give me meaning, and in return I would give him his glory. And God was silent, nor do I blame him. The silence that drives one man mad finds another consoling, but God is still good, and madness is not forever. The silence that drives one man, and God was silent, nor do I blame him. The silence that drives one man mad finds another consoling. God is still good, and madness is not forever. The dread that propels one man into action drives another into hiding, but God is still good. I have come to endure the silence of God in the same way the blank space of sky outlines the hills. But this is what causes me true fear. What if I wake and find the blank spaces fading? The blank spaces of silence that, by their void, contrast joy and meaning from dust. What if I wake and shiver despite the sun in the morning? What if I wake and find that silence has fled into the darkness, that the dawning of light has dispersed? What if I wake and find the skin in my eyes shrunken and dry? What if I wake and find less meaning in pain than in joy for joy's sake alone? And this is the fear into which I am falling. After ourselves, what is left? If God is not silent, I would doubt him the more, but if he only roars, I will hate him. And so I conclude, we don't fear the silence, but the calling. And so I conclude, I don't fear the silence. I fear the calling. Thank you guys for your time.